Time for the Northern Sun Radio News Show with your host, Don Olson, every Thursday morning at 9 o'clock here on your community radio station, KFAI. This is your host, Don Olson. First, we have Joseph Schwartzberg, who has a new book out called Transforming the United Nations Systems, Designs for a Workable World. He was a professor at the University of Minnesota from 1964 to 2000, and he's now retired. And his academic specialties were a geography of South Asia, political geography, and history of cartography. And way back in my university days, I took political geography course from Joseph Schwartzberg, and really enjoyed it because I learned a lot about some places that are now in the news in the middle of Asia. He was in the military during the Korean War, and he's visited over 100 countries. He's lived in India, Germany, France, and Spain. He's been a lifelong peace and social justice activist, and he co-founded in 1996 the Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers. He has been on the board of the World Federalist Association, which became known as Citizens for Global Solutions. And an abiding interest of his has been the United Nations, and he has this new book out called Transforming the United Nations Systems, Designs for a Workable World, put out by the United Nations University Press. Welcome to Northern Sun News, Joseph Schwartzberg.
Good to be here, Don.
So you have some of the people who talk about the problems, and a lot of people don't even follow much the United Nations, and they don't know much about it. But it's you're of the opinion that really needs to be changed. It needs to be updated in order to be relevant for what's going on today.
Well, the reason that people don't follow the United Nations much is because the United States still regards itself as capable of solving most of the world's problems, and our leadership has come to the conclusion that the United Nations is necessary only in a pinch when America can't do the job. But even then, we don't think that the United Nations has much capability, and one of the reasons that it doesn't have much capability is because we've insisted on a no-growth budget. We've opposed the expansion of its powers, and we say, well, only we are capable of doing the job.
Well, it's yes. So also often they just use it. The United States has used it for its own ends, and when it can't do that, it does a workaround using NATO or other ways of doing things. So, your book, you go through what the various points are. The two biggest things are the General Assembly and the Security Council, and you've got an idea about having a World Parliamentary Assembly. So let's start off now. The General Assembly, this is where everyone all the countries of the world which have been admitted, which is just about everybody, are all part of.
That's correct. The General Assembly is a universal body, as are a number of other agencies within the UN system. And it operates on the principle of one nation, one vote, which is rather unrealistic because if you just compare, for example, the population of this least populous country in the UN, that's Nauru in the Southwest Pacific, it's 9,300 people. China, 1.3 billion people. The ratio, 145,000 to 1. Each has one vote. Well, when decisions are made by a body with that disparity in given power, no one's going to respect that power. It has no relationship to the distribution of power in the real world outside the arena of the UN itself. So that's one of the principal problems that I try to deal with in the book.
You even call it an immoral egalitarianism.
Well, I think it is immoral. I mean, in many ways, and it certainly does not command respect. and it does not convey legitimacy. So the question is, how do you have a system of weighted voting which will be more acceptable, which will be more realistic? And I spend a lot of time on weighted voting, not only in the General Assembly, but in all the major organs of the United Nations system.
So you want to have weighted voting, that you would, you've got this little scheme for how you would come about it, that you say would make it a lot more representative and acceptable.
Right. I think weighted voting has to take into consideration not only population, which is pretty obvious to most people, but also the ability to transform the world for the better, and that's economic power, which many people object to. I give a lot of talks on United Nations reform, and the area in which I most frequently questioned is the question of rewarding economic power. I like to think of it as capacity to do good, and there's no incentive for wealthy nations to be a part of the system unless they get some sort of recognition for their contributions. So the job in devising workable weighted voting formulae is to balance the needs of shareholders, those people who pay the bills, and the needs of stakeholders, those people who reap the benefits or rewards of the decisions made by a particular agency within the UN system. So that's the formula that I use is that the weight of a nation, this is for the General Assembly, it will be the average of three factors: the country's population as a percentage of that of all the UN members, which is virtually 100% of the world's population, not quite, 99.6. Its percentage of the contributions to the core budget of the United Nations as a percentage of the total contributions, and its percentage of the membership, which is 1 over 193, or 0.51. And you take the average of those three percentages and you get the voting weight. And similar formulae are used for other agencies, tailored to the specific activities that the agency performs.
Now, some people might say that, well, you're going to take all the power away from the weak ones, but actually you say that it's still going to be strongly biased in favor of the weak, but not nearly to the absurd degree that characterizes the present system. Well,
38% of 38 nations would gain power, but those 38 nations have about 85% of the world's people. So the other 163, I think it is, 165 would lose power, some very slightly and some significantly. So one might ask, why would they possibly vote for a system in which they would lose power? Because right now they have the power to do nothing, because all the decisions made by the General Assembly are advisory. They don't have real power. So the nations that would lose would go down from having about 83% of all the votes down to about 38%. Well, 38% of something is worth a great deal more than 83% of nothing. And that's what the weak nations of the world have now. They have a dominant control over nothing. And that's by design, because the major powers, the P5, when the UN was set up, didn't want the small nations to have power. They wanted to in effect, monopolize decision-making in real terms and give the semblance of power to the small nations. Well, that's one of the reasons why the UN has not been accorded the respect that it ought to have.
Well, in the General Assembly, which is the largest assemblage of all the nations, people can discuss a lot of different things, and they do have a series of meetings that start in the fall every year, and they have all the world, a good number of the world leaders come to address it. But it's their decisions when they take a vote, should they do that, don't have much of they don't have any force of anything, do they?
None whatsoever, except in regard to the budget. They do control the budget. They do they do agree to appointments, that is to say, certain appointments like that of the Secretary General have to be approved by the General Assembly. But the General Assembly is, when nations cast votes in the General Assembly, they all often look over their shoulder and they say, how will this affect our relationships with the United States or China or any other major power? And they vote accordingly. So they are not really unfettered votes. And it doesn't really matter because nothing hangs in the balance. But when the chips are down and their votes really count, and they'll vote in slightly different ways.
Well, kind of a interesting thing I had never heard of about having, that's something you're proposing, is a World Parliamentary Assembly. And that you think that if this could be established, the could, that would work with the General Assembly, I believe, and it could evolve from being an ineffectual talk shop, as you call it, to a viable legislative body, and that if that decisions would be better if it represented people as well as states or governments.
On many issues, the people are well ahead of their governments. The governments tend to be pretty conservative, and the people, after all, it's a temporary job. It won't pay well, and they can speak their mind. And on the whole, the people are more inclined to vote for issues in which justice will be served than are their governments. And if a majority of the people, or a big majority of the people, expresses its will in a certain way, it's very difficult for a democratic government to ignore that. They have the political power to do that. If the Parliamentary Assembly would, at the outset, also be only advisory. In time, it would evolve, as happened in Europe, to be given actual legislative power, but that's not on the immediate horizon. But to say that the voice of the people could be ignored with impunity is to miss an opportunity to move forward on a great many issues that concern global peace and justice.
So, well, for people all over the world, how would you even select who would be part of this World Parliamentary Assembly?
How would it happen?
Yes.
Well, Article 22 of the UN Charter says that the General Assembly can form subsidiary bodies to help it in its work. So it would not require charter amendment. That's, in fact, many bodies have been formed or reformed through the use of Article 22 of the Charter. The Human Rights Committee, for example, became the Human Rights Council by vote of the General Assembly in 2005, and similar changes have been made. And so long as that body is deemed a body to help the General Assembly with its work.
Now, so that they would have these elections and people would be elected or somehow selected, and then they would come to New York. And that you're saying there would probably have to be a new building that would house their functions? Is that right?
Yes, I think so. In fact, there's no reason why it has to be in New York. It could be in Geneva. It could be in Nairobi. It could be any place the General Assembly decides that it should be. That's not a major issue.
And so what would these people do?
What would they do? They would deliberate issues like terrorism or weapons of mass destruction or the obscene North-South economic gap, and make recommendations for ameliorating those situations that are troublesome. There would be no legal obligation for the General Assembly or any other organ of the United Nations system to follow through, but if they ignored the wishes of the people, they'd have to account for their disregard, and some people would be voted out of office for ignoring the wishes of their own people.
And this would be, you say, a fairly hefty sum, perhaps, $500 million U.S., when the whole regular United Nations budget is about $1.8 billion U.S. Where's all this money going to come from?
Well, let's suppose that all the nations of the world were taxed 0.1% of their gross national product to support the United Nations system. The gross world product is something like $63 trillion. 0.1% of 63 trillion is 63 billion. The actual budget of all the UN agencies combined, that includes groups like the World Health Organization, which is fighting Ebola, the Food and Agricultural Organization, you put them all together and it's barely $24 billion. So if you just taxed all nations equally at 0.1% of the budget of their gross national product, you'd have 2.5 times as much in terms of working revenue for the UN as you do at present. Most people think that the UN is a costly activity. In fact, $1.8 billion, which is the annual expenditure now, is so small it's a joke. That's the annual budget for the core agencies. It doesn't count the budgets of those affiliated agencies such as the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture, UNESCO, and many others. So the UN is a bargain compared to. Its budget is much less than that of the state of Minnesota.
Oh, is that right? Yes, that's right. Most countries of the world, though, are just scraping by, or at least that's what the impression that I have. But so you think that they could come up with this?
Well, they managed to come up with larger sums for their military, and the UN could do more to establish global peace than their puny militaries, which might take 4 or 5% of the total budget, and those are typical percentages. So if they can do that and get some F-16 bombers to give them prestige, and then they should be able to afford 0.1% of their GNP for the use of an agency that could truly help them.
So let's have now. You're really deep in with all these people that around the world that have been writing about ways to change the United Nations, to reform it. And is there much of a call for a world parliamentary system, or is this something that
in Europe it's a known thing? I went to a conference last October in Brussels that had representatives from 23 countries, and it was held at the European Parliament. The host agency was the European Parliament, which sees a global parliamentary assembly as a body which would be modeled on itself to a large degree. It's shown the way it started out with a consultative body of appointed officials, and then the officials were elected, and then the officials that were elected were given actual legislative powers. And that seems to be a trajectory that the European Parliament thinks could be taken at the global level. So the conference was hosted, as I said, by the European Parliament. The President of the European Parliament sent a very supportive message to it, and there were activities in October, and there will be this October also, around the world, not much in the United States because of our general disregard for global institutions, but around the world in many other countries there were activities in support of a UN Parliamentary Assembly. And worldwide, over 1,300 parliamentarians, of whom 800 are incumbents, have gone on record in support of the Parliamentary Assembly. In the United States, only 5, but one of them is Don Fraser of Minnesota, and so Don and I have been trying to get additional support, without much success, I might say, from other parliamentarians or members of the House of Representatives or Senate, past or present, for a parliamentary assembly, and that effort will go on.
So Don Fraser was a long-time representative in the of city of Minneapolis and surrounding suburbs.
That's right, 16 years. Mm-hmm.
And he was, and then he left there and became the mayor of Minneapolis.
Right. And another of the Americans who have gone on record, he's a friend of mine who support this idea, is John Anderson, who ran for president in 1980 and got 6 million votes. He's on record as supporting a World Parliamentary Assembly as well. Pat Schroeder of Colorado, there are 5 or 6 that have already declared their support.
Well, we'll tease out some more there about support and these changes. We're speaking with Joseph Schwartzberg. He has a new book out called Transforming the United Nations System, Designs for a Workable World. And it's put out by the United Nations University Press. They don't necessarily endorse what you're saying, but they printed it, and you were quite happy.
You get it through Amazon or Barnes & Noble or the Brookings Institution Press. Just go online and put in my name and or the title, and you'll come up with the correct information to enable one to order the book.
And Schwartzberg is SCHWARTZBERG, Schwartzberg. Black Mountain. I took German. So let's get to the one that is now the key power center in the United Nations, the Security Council. And it's this is right now we have 5 permanent members. As you say, the 5 of the winning countries of World War II, and then there's now 10 others on a rotating basis, and that the 5 permanent members, which are United States, now Russia, now the People's Republic of China, France, and United Kingdom, they have veto power, and they can stop any particular vote in the Security Council. And then the 10 others, even if all 10 vote together, they can't override any kind of a veto by one of the other Security Council members. So what's wrong with that?
Well, it's not representative. It's arbitrary, and some of the countries that are of the P5, the UK and France, for example, or for that matter, Russia, have far less power in real terms than other countries that are rising, such as, say, Brazil or India, and that's unjust. Or Germany. Germany has a much bigger economy than either the UK or France, and much, much bigger than that of Russia. And it's not represented. It's represented more often than any other country other than Japan. Japan has a much greater economic power than those 3 countries that are there. So it has become it has lost representativeness, it has lost legitimacy, and because of the demographics involved, the P5, which had 18% of the world's population in 1945, now have the P4, I should say, excluding China, which had 18% of the world's population in 1945, now have only 9% of the world's population because they have small growth rates. So they become increasingly unrepresentative with the passage of time. And of course, the UN has grown enormously in membership. So people question the legitimacy of the Security Council. In only 8 years out of 68 since the UN was founded, has the Security Council been included over half of the world's people, the nations that are represented. And in all 8 of those years, it's when India was a member. In 1965, the largest before the Security Council was enlarged, the 6 non-permanent members were accounted for only 1% of the world's population. The largest of those 6 was the Netherlands, which is a fairly small country demographically. And 2 years in 1966, the Security Council was enlarged to 15 members. In 1967, when India and Japan and Brazil and Nigeria were all added, it suddenly went from, for the non-permanent members, they went from 1% of the total population of the world to 17% of the population of the world. It's arbitrary, and the countries that are representative represented don't really represent anyone but themselves. For example, for 2 terms on the Security Council, the island nation of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean represented Africa south of the Sahara. Well, the dominant population of the island of Mauritius is South Asian, is Indian. So Indians were representing Africa. And but when the Mauritian delegate on the Security Council voted, he never asked himself, well, what's best for Senegal or Ethiopia or South Africa or Egypt? He said, what's best for Mauritius? And there's nothing representative about that. Mauritius is a country with barely over 1 million people. And we've had countries on the Security Council, the smallest of which was Malta, with 250,000 people, that had cast a vote that counted the same as that of India. And they were on the Security Council at the same time for 1 year. But there's nothing representative about that. It's almost chaotic. So what I've recommended is that you have a Security Council which represents nations from 12 regions of the world and represents them on the basis of a weighted voting formula, which takes both gross national product or contributions to the UN budget and population into effect. And then a third term, which is equivalent to the sovereign equality of nations, one nation, one vote, is one region, one vote, or that is to say 1/12 of the world's population, 1/12 of the vote, 8.33%, which is 1/12, would be one of the 3 terms in the weighted voting equation, the other 2 terms being population and contributions to the budget. And then you could get votes with as much as not quite 17% for Europe, down to 4% for what I've called the Westminster League, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the islands of the South Pacific Forum, which are, for the most part, tutelary states of either Australia or New Zealand. So that would be 4% of the votes, and that's what you get via the formula. And so you could have a Security Council that's completely representative, that's where every nation has a voice, and then with the electronic means of communications, you could actually come to decisions which were impossible to reach in 1945. And I've spelled out how that would work in some detail in the book. There are literally scores of proposals for enlarging the Security Council by anywhere from 1 to 10 seats. And so to the best of my knowledge, there is no scheme other than my own for reducing the size of the council from the present 15 to 12 members, but making it universal.
So it represents these 12 regions, and you're saying that right now the great powers have a propensity to resort to bribery and coercion to influence the votes of weak nations. But this, with your scheme, this would be gotten rid of because it'd be virtually impossible to bribe or coerce a multinational region.
Absolutely. That's an important thing. People don't realize the extent to which power politics pressure on small nations by big nations who have some degree of leverage over their economy or political system or armed forces, how much of a factor that is in global politics. But this would minimize that factor.
And that you say maybe sometime in the future you would even get rid of eliminate the veto.
Oh, yes. There'd be no need for the veto. There'd be a trade-off. One of the firm rules of politics is that nobody gives up something for nothing. So in other words, if you want to get rid of the veto, you've got to give something in return. In the case of the United States, our voting power in the system that I've described would be about 12.5%. I don't remember the exact percentage. But so that's 1/8 of the total. Right now it's 1/15 of the total. So we would double our power, and that's a significant trade-off. And so we'd be swapping the use of the veto for a doubling of our weight from 1/15 to roughly 1/8, and I think that's saleable.
Well, you talk about at the end your book, that you have a strong preference for a constitutional system of democratic federal world government characterized by a division of powers among executive, legislative, and judicial branches. But virtually every election we have many Republican candidates. Sometimes there's billboards out there talking about how the United Nations is undermining the sovereignty of the United States, and that this is just the worst possible thing that could happen. How would you overcome all this?
Right. There's a lot of anti-UN prejudice, as there's prejudice in the United States against any form of multilateralism. We think we know the answers and we can do it alone. Well, we've proved time and again in the last decade that we can't do it alone. We've made a mess of Iraq. We're paying a price for it right now. We've made a mess of other parts of the world, Afghanistan, and we thought we could go in with military force and solve the local problems or reformulate the governmental system and make Iraq a model shining democracy for the rest of the Middle East to follow. It couldn't have been a greater fiasco. And when Americans come to realize that we can no longer rule the world, then we have to say, well, something has to make global decisions. Global problems require global solutions, and the United States is not the global solution. It's the American solution, and the American solution is not good enough. We need global solutions, and the only agency, the only system that I'm aware of that could provide the necessary legitimacy and authority is the United Nations system.
But what about the multinational corporations who just want to go out there and rape and pillage?
Yeah, well, there are a problem. There are many problems, and the MNCs are one. But many people don't realize that a lot of the good work that the multinational corporations do, they do a lot of good and a lot of bad. But when they do good, it's often through what's called global compacts. These are actual written agreements between multinational corporations, agencies within the United Nations system, such as WHO, and some group of countries. It might be one country, it might be several countries, say, of East Africa, and they would embark on things like educational reform, community development. There are literally thousands of global compacts that have been signed in the last decade, and most Americans have never even heard of the global compact system because, again, the press does not accord the UN much space, and so unless you read some of the alternative press, you're going to be unaware of the existence of this mechanism for using the resources of the multinational corporations for good rather than for evil.
So, how would you work now to get public opinion for this? I mean,
well, that's why I wrote the book, and I give a great many talks, of which this is one, and to different groups. I welcome invitations. If you want to contact me, it's schwa004@umn.edu. And I'd be happy to talk to your group if you have a group that might be interested in the United Nations. I'm paying to have the book translated into Spanish so that it can reach more than 30 countries in Central and South America, and in Spain, of course, itself. And I'm in the process of starting a Workable World Trust, which the assets of which will go to spread knowledge of the reforms that I propose to a wider audience. I have sent the copies of the book to every 1, 2, or 3 copies to every UN mission. I've gotten recognitions, thanks from the foreign ministers or the delegates of these missions from a great many important countries. So it's a slow process, a gradual process, but we're getting the word out, and we think that it's a message that people are waiting to hear because they realize that that a Pax Americana, an American-led peace, is no longer an attainable goal.
I want to thank you, Joseph Schwartzberg. You say that your goal is to promote a world that is workable, not a Future Utopia. And this is a book that you have been, well, it's kind of a summation of a lot of other monographs and papers you've written and other books you've written, called Transforming the United Nations System, Designs for a Workable World, put out by the United Nations Press. And thank you very much for coming in today.
My pleasure, Don. Good seeing you again.
Indeed it is. We're going to be getting to my next guest in just a second, but this has been the Northern Sun Radio News Show here on Fresh Air Community Radio, KFAI 90.3 FM Minneapolis and 106.7 FM St. Paul, Radio Without Boundaries.